is it weird that I kinda hated seeing Ryusui in space? That's how I felt at first anyway. To be honest, it was awesome to see him come to the rescue, and the way he did it was absolutely insane. But once I had a few minutes to think about it, I was like, wait a minute, doesn't this kinda ruin all his emotional scenes from earlier? I noticed this was something a good chunk of other people also had an issue with. So in this video, I want to discuss why this is such a weird scene for people, but explain how it ultimately still works. Be warned that this will contain spoilers. Before I get started, make sure to comment with your thoughts on the Ryusui twist. I'll pick my favorite and share as comment of the week in the next video. This week's comment goes to Party Jams for sharing their thoughts on dialogue in Dr. Stone. If you'd like more Dr. Stone and other manga discussions like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. So to get started, I should probably explain why this is even a concern in the first place. Cause, I mean, come on, it's Ryusui in space. It's basically like having Luffy on the moon. Anyway, as hype as this is, which it is, this scene also seems to conflict with Ryusui's actions in the previous chapters. If you recall, it had been teased for ages that Ryusui would be the space team pilot. There were times where they literally came right out and said he was the pilot before they even started making the team. But of course, once they actually made the team, Ryusui started thinking about who the best pilot was in the Stone World. Naturally, his mind went to the one and only Stanley Snyder. Cause once you see that plane coming towards you and you find out who the pilot is, it just becomes that Jason Bourne meme and you're sitting there like, Jesus Christ, it's Stanley Snyder. In short, everyone knows he's a goddamn legend, and this was painfully obvious for our boy Ryusui. So he made the executive decision to revive Stanley and have him take his spot. And this was presented to us as a sacrifice on at least 4 separate occasions. First, we had the scene where Ryusui asked for Senku's advice and basically compared Stanley to a prince that was guaranteed to save the world. The two of them both acknowledged that Stanley was the logical choice, but we see that Ryusui knew this was going to be his answer. So it's this kind of vulnerable scene where Ryusui knows exactly what Senku's answer is going to be, but he either wanted to hear him actually say the words, or was somehow hoping that Senku would tell him otherwise. Later on, we have the scene where our dear Dr. Chelsea comes right out and asks Ryusui if he's okay with giving up his dream of going to space, to which Ryusui just doesn't have an answer. And this is actually the first scene that kinda trips you up, because the way Chelsea words this suggests that Ryusui is definitely not going to space once they revive Stanley. After that, we have the scene where Ryusui is practicing his aim as the quote, backup. Take note of this because I completely forgot about it and it bit me in the ass. Which is understandable given the ending of this chapter. We have Francois commend Ryusui for setting aside his personal desire for the sake of victory for mankind. Again, like with Chelsea, this wording of setting aside his personal desire makes it seem like he gave up being the pilot and that Ryusui would not go to space, which is only supported by Ryusui breaking into an ugly cry and saying he wanted this so bad, suggesting that it's something that he can no longer have. Finally, we have the launch scene where Ryusui gives Stanley a little send-off speech, claims he stole his spot as the pilot, and asks if he's up to the job. Stanley says that he can, and the two share an epic yet somewhat awkward fist bump. Here, Stanley acknowledges the responsibility of this job, showing us that he's not just doing it to complete the mission, but also to meet the expectations of the person who so desperately wanted this. It's another scene that gives the impression that Ryusui has given up his dream, this time reflected by Stanley's resolve to meet Ryusui's expectations. Stanley is prepared to complete the mission because he knows he's taking Ryusui's dream. So when you add all of this up, you get a clear understanding that Ryusui has given up his dream for the greater good. The way these scenes are presented leads you to believe, or at least feel, like Ryusui made a sacrifice, that he chose one thing at the expense of the other, which is why I was very confused with the release of Chapter 225. As you'll recall, the team is in the dark and is unable to complete their docking, before Ryusui comes along and saves the day by spinning as if the very fate of Beyblade depended on it. And obviously this is epic because we have Ryusui, the mad lad of Dr. Stone, traipsing through the stars all by himself and declaring outer space as his own. To which someone on my community tab rightfully noted is very, very in his character. And speaking of in his character, this scene was very in character for Ryusui. No explanation is really needed because it's just kind of the thing he does. Even our boy Sai's like, yeah, sounds like Ryusui. And this was pretty much my initial reaction. But once I had finished the chapter, I finally remembered all those scenes we just discussed and was like, wait a minute. So were all those emotional scenes we had just a giant waste of time? But remember that quote I told you to make note of, where Ryusui literally calls himself the backup? To those of you who actually read Dr. Stone, congratulations. You probably remembered this and had zero problem with this scene. But to the rest of you, like myself, who have the attention span of a squirrel, we really only have ourselves to blame. Because Ryusui literally says that he's the backup. So surprise, surprise, when the team needs a backup, the guy who says he's the backup comes and does some backing up. So to be perfectly honest, this scene works just fine. It's in Ryusui's character to make this sort of adventurous space rescue, and we were told right before this that this is something Ryusui might have done. Now, of course, this isn't the end of the conversation, because even if this isn't bad writing per se, and it wasn't an ass pull, as the kids are saying these days, reading Dr. Stone is still a subjective experience, and you're still within your rights to feel like this was a poor decision by Inagaki. Then again, this is the new age of Dr. Stone, where people don't even need a reason to bash on Inagaki because he's somehow fumbling the ending, but in this case, these concerns are fairly warranted. As far as I can see, there's two reasons you still might not like this decision. First of all, even if it wasn't an ass pull, it still kind of feels like Ryusui had his cake and ate it too. In other words, you might feel like Ryusui got all the benefits of making a responsible sacrifice, while also getting the fun of acting like a space captain. And you would be perfectly right if Ryusui was sacrificing any chance of going to space. But he didn't. See, this is why all those emotional scenes were so misleading, because they give you the impression that this is precisely what Ryusui was doing. So if you didn't pay attention or forgot about Ryusui's mention of being the backup, then you would believe that this is actually what he was doing. But the fact that he gives his spot to Stanley and still calls himself the backup helps to clarify things. To be clear, it wasn't that Ryusui gave up any chance he had of going to space. It was more like he gave up his guarantee of going to space. He had a guaranteed spot, but exchanged that for a possibility of going to space. So by going to space as the backup, his sacrifice remains intact, because it still wasn't a guarantee that he would need to go help Senku. But even with this logical explanation, you can still not like this twist. For the sake of illustrating why, consider the sacrifice that Tsukasa made. He was guaranteed to be the warrior, but saw that Kohaku was just as capable, and decided to have her go in his place. The difference here is that the character growth is in Tsukasa recognizing and admitting that science is the ultimate equalizer. He didn't necessarily need to give up his spot on the space team to do that. But with Ryusui, the whole idea was that he was growing by giving up his desire. He could only do that by giving up his spot as the pilot. So to have him do that but still go up as the backup kinda feels like he cheated by using a loophole. But to be perfectly honest, there's no right or wrong answer here. If you feel everything worked out, then that's great. And if you feel like Ryusui cheated, that's perfectly fine. They're both sorta true, so it's really up to you and your experience with the chapter. Now, on a similar note, the other reason you still might not like this twist is because it might foreshadow the death of Stanley. As this person here put it, Ryusui's presence basically tells us that Stanley is going to die for the sake of the mission, and Mr. Backup here is going to fill in for the return trip. At least that's how I see it, because here's the thing. Even if it's not going to happen, the fact that we got a second pilot at the last second has me expecting one of those pilots not to survive. And look, all I'm saying is if he's got to choose between the fan-favorite playboy and a guy who almost killed Senku, I'm sorry, but I'm sure Inagaki would choose Stanley. But the awkward part here is that we don't know if this is going to happen. If it doesn't, then no harm done. Even if it does, then you could still be surprised and find that this twist in 225 didn't ruin the experience. So for the moment, this is another way that you are the one who decides whether this was a good or bad call. It all comes down to your experience, even if the writing checks out. And this is why I said that this has been one of the strangest chapters of Dr. Stone. It was set up with all of these emotions, then the big reveal filled me with all of these new emotions. Then I was just plain confused before I realized why I shouldn't be. And after all that, I still don't have a definitive answer for you. Unlike most scenes in Dr. Stone where I can pretty much write a doctoral dissertation on why Inagaki is a freaking genius, this scene is entirely in your hands. And that's why, at least to me, it's just about the weirdest chapter in Dr. Stone. And that's it for this discussion. If you enjoyed this discussion, then make sure to like the video. Don't forget to comment with your thoughts down below. And if you'd like more Dr. Stone and other manga discussions like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.